It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search it out is the glory of kings. This is the Message to Kings podcast.
Welcome back to the Message to Kings podcast. This is your host, Brad Houston. Now that the Assyrian Empire has become one of the major players in world history at this point, I thought it would be best to do a special episode on the Assyrian War Machine. It's good to change things up a bit. Recently, I've been challenged by all the names of the kings coming and going, and they all seem to have those similar J names. It's definitely time for a change-up. Now, when Elisha dies in the next episode or two, the age of the fire prophets comes to an end, but this age isn't going to end quietly. But when it goes, we will head into Israel's zenith and fall. There will be some constants in this era. The messianic prophets will rise and dominate the landscape, even during the times of wicked kings, and another constant will remain, a dark horde over the horizon as well, the Assyrians who will threaten to engulf the whole world with their conquest. In this episode, we're going to cover the Assyrian army and why the Assyrians are so feared, and some background into these guys, which will give us a bigger perspective headed forward. I'm joined in this episode by a fellow biblical history student and listener of the podcast, Joshua Taylor. Joshua Taylor from Oregon contacted me, and we sat down over a coffee. And that's what you do in Seattle, Washington. We shared stories, talked about biblical history life, and we prayed for each other. I found Josh to be the real deal, a man touched by God who loves his family. Over coffee, we discussed some of the recent topics, and since he was in the military, I thought I would ask Josh if he'd be interested in having a recorded call talking about the Assyrian army. So Josh, please introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, of course, Brett. I'm a field artillery officer while wearing my U.S. Army hat. And I've spent 6.5 years on the fire support side, and the past 2.5 on the fire direction and battery side. So as to not kind of complicate things too much, on the fire support side, I was responsible for planning and coordinating echelons of fire support coordination measures, basically deconflicting a three-dimensional battlefield, depending on requirements of the mission and available assets that are available to me. So, I've had various armaments at my disposal, ranging really from, a 60 millimeter mortar, which is like your basic infantry artillery, basically, if you want to consider it. It's like David in his sling, to B-1 bombers. So, this really requires a great amount of responsibility and really the study of battlefield strategy and tactics. And the fire direction and battery side has really allowed me to get up close and personal with various different pieces of equipment, like the Mike 777, 155 millimeter, and the Mike is a military vernacular, but the 119 Alpha 3, which is a 105 millimeter howitzer. To put these pieces of equipment in, to paint a picture for those listening, the 777 can put a 100-pound round, a shell, 155 millimeters within really three meters of its target from roughly about 80 miles away. So, it's pretty impressive if you ask me.
Wow, Josh, it's like I can hear the artillery shells going off. I mean, it's a crazy detail and amazing. Let me pull this back a bit for the non-military listeners, or those who just don't have as much background in the artillery or the military. Can you tell us the purpose of the artillery?
Well, sure. But, to give you a textbook answer, something that's kind of drilled into me during schooling. You know, the mission of the field artillery is to destroy, neutralize, or suppress the enemy by cannon, rocket, and missile fire, and to help integrate all fire support assets into combined arms operations. And so, you know, that's the textbook answer. But, you know, honestly, the purpose of artillery is to really kind of cause chaos on the battlefield, and really disrupt rhythms, to cause the enemy, whoever they may be, to have to really, really second guess their actions and what they're going to do next. And you know, things are changing even as we speak, as far as like the role of the field artillery, you know, in future battles. But probably not a good topic for today.
Probably not. So coming from a military background with your experience and the expertise in the artillery, you got to be extremely qualified to speak about the expertise of the Assyrian army, since they have come to be known as artillery experts by military standards, at least of their day. And before we go into the grid of the Assyrian organization and military, let's give a bit of cultural background. The Assyrians were an empire on the rise. They believed in fear projection and terror, and they were horrible when it came to the treatment of their enemies. If a city didn't surrender, they destroyed it. They truly believed in corporal punishment. They did have some cultural and artistic expertise, but most of it was used to express and leave to history a story of gore and intimidation. Most of their artifacts express the destructive nature of their military campaigns and the inexhaustible blood that they shed. They worshipped a variety of gods, and I have to point out the god of war was way too common in their worship. At this point in our podcast, they have taken Babylon, Tyre was now paying tribute, and Damascus has fallen. Israel was wide open for conquest. In the future, the Assyrian army will march as far south as Jerusalem and even Egypt. Their focus was on their military, and fear of them stretched wide. Let's cover their armies. Josh, let's chat about the Assyrian War Machine. And then we're going to conclude with an interesting question. Does Israel have a chance against this newly reformed army under Adad-Nirari III?
Well, Brett, I mean, you really start to paint just a crazy visual in my head. I mean, you got to think about the Assyrians. You know, they created the world's first great army and the world's first great empire. You know, this was held together by two factors. Number one, their superior abilities in siege warfare and their reliance on sheer, unadulterated terror. I mean, it was Assyrian policy always to demand that examples be made of those who resisted them. This included deportations of entire peoples and horrific physical punishments. I mean, one inscription from a temple in the city of Nimrod records the fate of the leaders of the city of Saru, which was part of the Babylonian Empire on the Euphrates River, you know, who rebelled from them. So, and were reconquered by, now here, I'm going to follow your footsteps here and just totally mangle this name, but King Ashurbanipal, close. Here's what it read. I built a pillar at the city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. Some I walled up inside the pillar. Some I impaled upon the pillar on stakes. I mean, come on. That's just intense. You know, I mean, you know, some punishments were not uncommon. You know, furthermore, inscriptions recording these vicious acts of retribution were displayed throughout the empire to serve as a warning, really. Yet this officially sanctioned cruelty seems to have really led, seems to have had the opposite effect. I mean, sometimes, really, if you think about it, because though the Assyrians and their army were respected and feared, they were most of all hated, and the subjects of their empire were in almost constant state of rebellion. It's just a crazy way of ruling. I mean, I couldn't imagine leaders of today trying to rule that way. Can you, Brett?
Yeah, this was a horrible, horrible time to live. We see all types of movies. I think of Braveheart, and you can see how horrible it was in Scotland in a certain time frame. Other movies kind of will give you a taste of horrible time frames when oppressive nations are in are overruling states and such. But this is bad. I mean, the Assyrians and the terror projection, the fear, the atrocities. It's intense. There is no lack of material on their terror tactics and atrocities. So, Josh, what did their army look like?
Well, Brett, the Assyrian kings of this time had at their disposal quite literally the largest, most well trained, and best equipped fighting force in the history of the world up to that time. I think the historian Paul Kowarczyk describes it how the army would have appeared to an opponent roughly in kind of mid 700 BC in this following passage. So I'm going to go ahead and read this for you. He would have seen in the center of the formation the main body of infantry, compact phalanxes of spearmen, their weapon points glittering in the sun, each arranged in 10 files of 20 ranks. He would have marveled and perhaps trembled at the discipline and precision of their maneuvering, a contrast relatively freewheeling manner of previous armies. For the reforms had introduced a highly developed and effective command structure. Infantrymen fought in squads of 10, each headed by an NCO, and grouped into companies of 5 to 20 squads under the command of a captain. They were well protected and even better equipped, for Assyria was wielding the very first iron armies, iron swords, iron spear blades, iron helmets, and even iron scales sewn as armor on their tunics. Bronze weaponry offered no real contest. This new material, which was cheaper, harder, less brittle, could be ground sharper and kept a keener edge for far longer. Iron ore is not found in the North Mesopotamian heartland. So, every effort had been made to put all nearby sources of the material under Assyrian control. Assyrian spearmen were more mobile than their predecessors too. Rather than sandals, they now wore the Assyrian military invention that was arguably one of the most influential and long-lasting of all, the army boot, Brett. Can you believe it? In this case, the boots were knee-high leather footwear, thick-soled. They've been hobnailed and with iron plates inserted to protect the shins, which made it possible for the first time to fight on any terrain, however rough or wet, mountain or marsh, and in any season, winter or summer. This was the first all-weather, all-year army. These guys were the real deal. They didn't mess around. They meant business.
So, Josh, that's crazy. Like you told me about the iron armies, the iron breastplates and the iron swords and spear points. But when you said army boot, I'm thinking that's the practical win. These guys that they took over their known world in a way, not all of it, but most of their known world, and their greatest invention was the army boot. It's just amazing.
Yeah, you got to think as it this way. Like for practical reasons. These guys were they lived, they breathed, they died, they sweat war. If there's 300, right? That was a great movie, and those guys were pretty awesome, but the Assyrians were basically the start of what we now know to be your modern military. For them to have squads and squad tactics. I mean, we weren't even using those tactics in the Civil War, for crying out loud. We were lining up men with muskets and, shooting. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, these guys were on top of it. They had it figured out. And I could only imagine sitting around a campfire, or a fire, back then, cooking up their meal that they skewered for the day, and just some guy just talking about how his feet hurt. And then, I mean, just think about it. You got nothing else to do but to get better at what you do. These guys were true experts in their field and craft. If you were facing the Assyrian army at this time, you didn't stand a chance. They're like, hey, we're just going to become the best army in the world, so we're just going to go ahead and, because one of the first things you do as any military force is you are always making position improvements.
Yeah.
And so, I would imagine that what happened was they were just camped out, and someone was like, hey, man, my feet are killing me, And they're sitting over there, they're roasting some, probably not duck, but, they're probably skewered something. And they're sitting there by the fire talking about how they're going to throw some gigantic fireballs over the walls of these enemies of theirs. And someone just wrapped one of the, skins, like a lizard skin or something around their foot, tied some twine around it. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
All right. So at this point, the Assyrians, they probably lost Karkar, and they failed against Aram many times over. But like the Romans, they never stopped attacking, and they never gave up. And they broke through the walls finally of Damascus, ruining the height of the Aramean kingdom. Most historians point to their ability to perfect siege warfare in this age.
So, Brett, it's a really good time to really point out the Lachish write-ups and how they would besiege Samaria for 3 years, and how they weren't afraid to take on anybody. So, more than anything else, the Assyrian army excelled at siege warfare. And it was probably the first force to carry a separate corps of engineers. Assault was their principal tactic against the heavily fortified cities of the Near East. They developed a great variety of methods for breaching enemy walls. Sappers were employed to undermine walls or to light fires underneath wooden gates, and ramps were thrown up to allow men to go over the ramparts or to attempt a breach on the upper section of a wall where it was the least thick. Mobile ladders allowed attackers to cross moats and quickly assault any point defenses. These operations were covered by masses of archers. Who were the core of the infantry? But the pride of the Assyrian siege train were their engines, okay? These were multi-storied wooden towers with 4 wheels and a turret on top, and one or sometimes 2 battering rams at the base. They had basically perfected what they still use in the Middle Ages. Back in the times, when they had you see on Vikings, right? These guys had it figured out. The best documented Assyrian siege, however, was that of a city of Lachish. Sennacherib, like every other Assyrian king, was proud of his military conquest and had then depicted in detail in reliefs which lined the corridors of his palace, Nineveh. The siege of Lachish in 701 BC began, as such military contests often did, with the Assyrian envoys riding up to the city walls to demand surrender. The people were told that if they complied, they would be treated well, while if they resisted, they would suffer the common fate of all who had resisted them before. Even though it was well known that the Assyrians showed no mercy, the defenders of Lachish chose to take their chances and hold their city. Anglim describes the progression of the siege once the envoys returned to the Assyrian encampment. So the city was first surrounded to prevent escape. Next, the archers were brought forward. Under the cover of giant shields, they cleared the battlements. The king then used the tried and tested Assyrian method of building an earthen ramp close to the enemy wall, covering it with flat stone and wheeling forward a machine that combined a siege tower with a battering ram. The Assyrians then staged a two-pronged assault. The tower was wheeled up the ramp, and the ram was brought to bear against the midsection of the enemy wall. Archers in the tower cleared the battlements, while bowmen on the ground pushed up close to the wall to cover an infantry assault with scaling ladders. The fighting appears to have been intense, and the assault probably took several days. Yet eventually, the Assyrians entered the city. Archaeology has revealed that the place was looted and hundreds of men and women and children were put to the sword. The relief of the siege shows prisoners begging for mercy at the feet of Sennacherib. Others, less fortunate, perhaps the city's leaders, have been impaled upon stakes. Man, do anything you want, but don't impale me with a stake. Come on.
Yeah. It's gruesome work of the Assyrians. So, yeah, thanks, Josh, for kind of covering their organization, the military, in that siege of Lachish, which will come later. That's going to be a pretty well-documented archaeological event. So we'll cover more of that later. So this leads to a big question. This is what military thinkers do, right? They ask the hard question, or maybe it's just the scenario question. Here's my question for you, Josh. Does Israel stand a chance against these guys? I mean, Josh, what's your take? Does Israel have a chance against these organized, boot-wearing, terrorizing, atrocity-committing, very well-organized military machine of the Assyrians?
Well, Brett, from a military perspective, I mean, absolutely not. Israel has no chance against this world empire and its army. But from a spiritual perspective, all things are possible with God. I mean, just think of it. All the amazing things that because of the Lord's promise to his people of Israel that they were able to accomplish. I mean, even single men and his armor bearer, and Gideon taking on and with 300 over 100,000 troops. All things are possible, and just the times of bringing fire, prophets bringing fire down from heaven. It's no surprise that the Israelites have a chance.
Yeah, it's like the greater the odds, the greater the miracle.
Come on.
Yeah, and I mean, the odds will be so stacked against when Israel falls, Judah and Jerusalem will stand alone. I've even seen a map of the Assyrian Empire, and I can't remember if it includes Egypt at this point or not, but there's this entire mass, and Jerusalem is literally an island within their empire that stands alone under Hezekiah. And that's going to be the one scene, and when we get there, it's going to be most incredible when we think of God destroying armies. He's done it before, though. I mean, there's tons of history of God destroying armies and the supernatural. But this one, these Assyrians, they're fully loaded.
Yeah, it's they came with a full payload. I mean, as I just kind of look into this a little bit more, to prep for the episode, I mean, you gotta think about, facing a bunch of, Delta Squad, like SEAL Team 6, I mean, because of just the basicness of military, functionality back in the day. I mean, people have been doing things the same way forever. They didn't really do things that different. They fought the same way for, they're throwing rocks at each other, for crying out loud. I mean, rocks. You know what I mean? Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, they were very effective. But when you're going up against iron and shields, I mean, you want to talk about iron sharpening iron. They forced innovation when it came to warfare. Their tactics, I mean, without getting into a ton of detail, of their shield bearers and the bowmen and the archers, and the way that they covered for one another, and the way that they fought cohesively with one another, it's kind of unbeatable. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, in Jerusalem, when they do stand alone against Assyria, I mean, it's going to be at least 10-1. I mean, so they've got this numerical superiority as well. So thanks, Josh, for joining us for this episode of Message to Kings. I can't say thank you enough for just contacting me and just hanging out and getting to know you, and then just actually I thank you because you did a lot of the research for this episode as well, and sharing your expertise with the audience. So. And I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of Message to Kings. If anyone wants to continue in our conversation, on the Podomatic website, there's a area to leave comments, or you can email us directly at messagetokings@gmail.com. And Josh and I would love to continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone. Testing, testing, testing. And they broke through the walls finally of Damascus, ruining the height of the Aramean kingdom. Most Assyrians. Wow. Most Assyrian. Can you believe this? So at this point in our podcast, they've taken Babylon. Tyre was now paying tribute. And Damascus has fallen. That's just stupid.
I couldn't imagine leaders of today trying to rule that way. Can you, Brett?
No. This is a horrible age when it comes to violence. So there's no lack of material. There's no lack of material. Gosh.
So that lizard skin right on the bottom, right to their sandal. And there we go. There was the first boot.
The first boot.
Right?
The listeners in England are going to say, the first boot.
It's the first boot, man.
The guys in Germany. All right, let's see how it sounded. On the Podomatic website, there's a area to leave comments, or you can email us directly at messagetokings@gmail.com. And Josh and I would love to continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone, and good night. I'll ditch the good night.